So, imagine for a second that you're watching, I don't know, a collision in slow motion.
Oh, okay, I'm picturing it.
Right. So on one side of this massive intersection, you have the modern secular mandate for social harmony.
Which is basically this deeply ingrained idea that the highest moral good a society can possibly achieve is preventing anyone from ever feeling offended.
Exactly. You know, making sure nobody feels marginalized or uncomfortable.
Right.
But then speeding right through the red light from the completely opposite direction, you have this divine biblical mandate.
Demanding that believers speak absolute objective truths.
Yeah, and completely regardless of the social collateral damage that truth might cause.
It's massive impact.
It really is. When those two forces hit each other, the result isn't just like a cultural fender bender.
No, not at all.
It is a fundamental structural shattering of how we even communicate with each other.
Yeah, because it creates an environment where the basic tools of dialogue are just, well, they're weaponized. You're no longer just having a disagreement with someone. You are actively participating in a clash of entirely incompatible realities.
And that tectonic grinding is exactly what we are wading into today. So welcome to another edition of the Discernment Drop.
Glad to be here.
Our mission today for this deep dive is to unpack, analyze, and philosophically dissect a highly charged text.
A text that attempts to map out this exact collision in modern American culture and theology, right?
Exactly. According to the sermon by Pastor John L. Widdifield, titled, "The Suppression of Truth, How Woke and Liberal Policies Silence Dissent in America,"
That is quite the title.
it lays all its cards on the table immediately. And for the rest of our conversation, we'll just be referring to him simply as Pastor John.
Makes sense.
So his core premise operates on a very specific understanding of the battleground.
Right.
You know, usually when we think about a cultural debate, we expect a shared playing field.
Like a tennis match.
Exactly. You hit the ball over the net, your opponent hits it back.
And even if you're fiercely trying to defeat each other, you fundamentally agree on where the baselines are drawn.
Right. You agree on gravity, the dimensions of the court, how a point is scored.
And that shared reality is really what classical liberal thought was built upon.
Right. And to be clear, we mean liberal in the traditional Enlightenment sense.
Yes, exactly. The idea that the public square is this marketplace of ideas where competing philosophies can clash.
And through that friction, society inches its way closer to the truth.
In that framework, dissent is just a difference of opinion.
It's basically the healthy, necessary immune response of a functioning democracy.
But Pastor John's central thesis is that America has undergone a profound engineered shift.
We're definitely no longer playing on that shared tennis court.
No. He argues that under the influence of woke ideologies, one side is still trying to play tennis.
While the other side is playing, like, underwater water polo.
Yeah, and the umpire is aggressively shouting that the very concept of a net is a structural microaggression.
It's exhausting just thinking about it. He argues the culture has been fundamentally rewired to suppress dissent by reframing traditional truths as offensive or hateful.
To really understand how that rewiring actually works, we have to look at the mechanics of what Pastor John identifies as woke culture.
Right.
He points to a massive redefinition of terms, which is driven largely by frameworks like identity politics and intersectionality.
Okay, let's pause right there, because those terms get thrown around like confetti on cable news.
Oh, constantly.
And usually with zero context. If we want to understand Pastor John's critique, we need to explain the mechanics.
Fair enough.
Break down exactly how intersectionality and identity politics operate in this context, and why they shift the definition of truth.
Okay.
Explain it to me like I'm a 5-year-old, or actually maybe a very precocious 15-year-old.
Let's use the 15-year-old baseline. That's probably safer.
Good call.
So, historically, societal debates were largely focused on the validity of an idea, totally regardless of who was presenting it.
The idea stood on its own 2 feet.
Right. But identity politics shifts that focus.
Right.
It suggests that your political and social perspectives are inextricably linked to your personal identity.
So your race, gender, sexual orientation, things like that.
Exactly. And then intersectionality takes that a step further.
How so?
Well, it's an analytical framework that looks at how various forms of inequality or disadvantage compound and intersect.
Oh, I see.
So a society isn't just divided into simple categories. It's a complex web of intersecting marginalizations.
So under that specific framework, a person's lived experience of marginalization becomes the actual lens through which all truth is evaluated.
Precisely. And that is the core issue Pastor John is highlighting.
Right.
When you adopt that framework completely, objective truth is replaced by subjective lived experience.
Wow.
And if truth is subjective and it's tethered to identity, then disagreeing with someone's quote-unquote truth is no longer categorized as a mere difference of opinion.
It's categorized as an attack on their identity.
Yes. This is the mutation Pastor John is diagnosing. Dissent is suddenly relabeled as hate speech, bigotry, or even violence.
I mean, it is a brilliantly effective, if terrifying, rhetorical pivot.
It shuts down the conversation immediately.
Right. If I disagree with your proposal on, say, zoning laws, we have a debate.
Yeah.
But if I disagree with your moral framework and you successfully label my disagreement as a literal threat to your existential safety,
the debate is over before it even begins.
Exactly. I like to think of this as a societal traffic light.
Oh, I like that. Run with that analogy. How does the traffic light operate here?
So think about the public square as a massive intersection.
Okay.
Historically, classical liberalism gave us a green light for vigorous, messy public debate. You drive your ideas into the intersection, I drive mine.
Maybe there's an intellectual fender bender.
Yeah, exactly. But traffic keeps moving.
Right.
What Pastor John is arguing is that this intersection has been completely hacked.
The traffic light has been messed with.
The light has been permanently jammed onto a red light labeled hate speech.
Wow.
And honestly, you have to acknowledge the dark, strategic brilliance of it.
It is effective.
It is incredibly convenient to win an argument simply by declaring that your opponent's right to speak is deeply offensive.
You never actually have to defeat their argument with better logic.
Nope. You just disqualify their existence in the public square to maintain what the culture calls social harmony.
Which introduces a massive philosophical problem regarding epistemology.
Epistemology meaning the study of how we know what we know.
Exactly. Pastor John is highlighting the terminal danger of prioritizing subjective feelings over objective truth.
Right.
When a society decides that avoiding offense is the absolute highest moral good, truth ceases to be a fixed point.
It just becomes crowdsourced by cultural consensus.
Dictated by whoever wields the most cultural outrage at any given moment.
Meaning the goalposts aren't just moving, they are like strapped to the back of a panicked animal.
That's a great way to put it.
If truth is crowdsourced by feelings, and feelings are inherently volatile, then the truth changes by the hour depending on the trending topic.
Right.
So how can anyone build a stable society, let alone a stable moral framework, on a foundation of shifting emotional sands?
Well, according to Pastor John, they cannot.
Yeah.
And this cultural diagnosis leads us directly to the core anxiety of his sermon.
Which is?
When these ideologies frame dissent as bigotry to maintain social harmony, the harmony they achieve is entirely artificial.
It's a fragile peace.
It's a fragile peace achieved at the barrel of a cultural gun.
Wow.
People are terrified into silence. They refuse to speak their minds, even when they observe something fundamentally untrue.
Because the penalty for speaking is instant social exile.
Exactly.
So if the cultural traffic light is permanently stuck on red, how does a Christian driver navigate the intersection?
That is the million-dollar question.
Because Pastor John makes it explicitly clear that this isn't just a political annoyance for him.
Well, there's a profound theological crisis.
Right. If the secular world demands silence to keep the peace, why can't Christians just, politely nod, use the approved vocabulary, and keep their heads down to survive the corporate HR training?
And that question transitions us from the cultural diagnosis to the theological imperative.
Okay, let's unpack that.
From Pastor John's perspective, truth is not a social construct negotiated in a university sociology department.
Right.
Truth is a divine mandate. He roots this firmly in Scripture, citing Ephesians 4.15, which commands believers to speak the truth in love.
And he also brings up Romans 12.2, right?
Yes, which urges them to not be conformed to the pattern of this world.
Which essentially means the believer is biblically forbidden from assimilating into a culture of comfortable lies.
Even if those lies make everyone feel warm and validated.
Especially then.
That is the absolute crux of the mandate. Pastor John argues that prioritizing the temporary comfort of avoiding offense over the eternal well-being of souls
is a dereliction of spiritual duty.
Exactly. And to justify this, he points directly to the ministry of Jesus.
This is where it gets really interesting.
It does, because in modern secular portrayals, Jesus is often sanded down into this passive, hyper-tolerant, go-with-the-flow peacemaker.
Right, the guy who just wandered around the Galilee telling everyone to be nice to each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Pastor John shatters that image. He highlights that the biblical Jesus was actually a remarkably abrasive truth-teller.
He was dropping absolute rhetorical bombs.
He really was.
Yeah.
He consistently confronted the religious leaders of his day, the Pharisees and Sadducees. He confronted them with uncompromising, brutal truths about their hypocrisy and their spiritual deadness.
I mean, he called them whitewashed tombs and a brood of vipers.
Right. That is not the language of someone prioritizing social harmony.
Definitely not. But I want to play devil's advocate for a moment on behalf of the listener.
Please do.
Because there is an interesting historical wrinkle here. Pastor John notes that Jesus confronted the religious leaders.
Yes.
Yet Pastor John is using this blueprint to confront the secular culture. Those are slightly different targets, aren't they? I mean, Jesus was critiquing the internal corruption of the faithful.
Right.
Whereas Pastor John is focused heavily on the external corruption of the secular state.
That is a very astute distinction. Jesus was primarily reforming the household of faith.
Right.
However, Pastor John's broader application relies on the underlying principle. Jesus never allowed the prevailing power structure to dictate what was true.
Whether it was the religious Sanhedrin or the secular Roman authority.
Exactly. He operated entirely outside their approval matrices.
Which makes sense when you consider that a biblical prophet would make a terrible modern PR executive.
Oh, the worst.
Right. The modern public relations firm says minimize friction, maximize likability, validate the client's feelings at all costs.
And what does the biblical prophet say?
The biblical prophet walks into the room and says, "You are drinking from a poisoned well. Your actions are leading to destruction. Repent immediately."
It's terrible marketing.
It gets 0 stars on Yelp. But Pastor John leans heavily into John 8.3132, where Jesus says, "The truth will set you free."
And this brings us to the ultimate collision of definitions.
What do you mean?
We have two completely competing visions of freedom operating in the exact same space.
Okay, unpack those two visions.
The modern secular ideal is freedom from offense.
Right.
It is the intense desire to navigate the world without ever encountering an idea, a word, or a reality that makes you feel marginalized or invalidated. But the biblical ideal, as Pastor John presents it, is freedom through truth.
Even if it hurts.
True freedom only comes from aligning yourself with objective divine reality, even if that reality is initially painful, offensive, or utterly destructive to your ego.
Now, if we follow that logic to its natural endpoint, it creates a massive paradox regarding how we define love and compassion.
How so?
Well, if you truly believe that a person is walking blindly toward a cliff,
Right,
and they're wearing noise-canceling headphones, listening to a podcast about how cliffs are merely a social construct,
great analogy.
what is the most loving thing you can do?
Right.
The modern cultural mandate says, do not interrupt them. It is violent to critique their personal journey.
While Pastor John's theological mandate says,
Tackle them to the ground, because a bruised ego is vastly superior to a broken neck.
that perfectly encapsulates his argument.
Yeah.
The suppression of truth for the sake of avoiding offense runs entirely counter to a worldview that prioritizes eternal realities over temporary social harmony. And Pastor John doesn't leave this as a high-level philosophical thought experiment.
No, he really doesn't.
He takes this theological anvil and drops it directly onto the most volatile, painful flashpoints of human life.
He goes straight for the cultural third rails.
He absolutely does.
Let's examine how this philosophy applies to his two primary case studies: abortion and gender.
Okay.
These are arenas where the demand for cultural silence is arguably the most aggressive. Let's start with his analysis of abortion. Pastor John states that telling a woman she has committed murder through abortion is undeniably harsh.
Yes.
But he argues it is a fundamentally necessary truth to prevent further spiritual and emotional damage.
This is a critical juncture in the text because his argument synthesizes spiritual reality with psychological reality.
Explain that.
He isn't just shouting theological decrees into a vacuum. The text specifically anchors this point by citing a 2019 study by the American Psychological Association.
Okay, the APO.
Right. This study noted that a significant number of women experience profound feelings of guilt, shame, regret, and psychological distress following an abortion.
Which completely disrupts the modern narrative.
It does. Pastor John argues that the woke, liberal policy environment enforces a strict, suffocating silence around these negative emotional realities.
Because the prevailing cultural mandate demands that abortion be framed exclusively as healthcare or empowerment.
Or as a fundamental right. Any deviation from that narrative is suppressed. By suppressing the truth of what abortion actually is, which, in his theological framework, is the taking of a human life society, allows women to make a devastating, irreversible decision.
But the true cruelty, he argues, is what happens afterward.
Right. Society abandons them to suffer the psychological compounding of that trauma in total silence, because expressing regret violates the cultural orthodoxy.
I have to pause on the practical application of this because it seems incredibly difficult to navigate.
It is extremely difficult.
Pastor John acknowledges that calling abortion murder is harsh.
Yes.
Yet later in the sermon, he explicitly calls for believers to practice compassionate communication.
Right.
How on earth does one walk that tightrope?
Good fair question.
Is it conceptually possible to drop a theological bomb on someone compassionately? Like, hey, I say this with deep, abiding empathy, but you are a murderer.
Yeah.
That seems practically impossible to execute without causing the exact kind of instantaneous relational severing he's critiquing.
That tension forces us to examine the limits of modern vocabulary. For Pastor John, compassionate communication does not mean softening the truth until it becomes palatable or unrecognizable.
So what does it mean?
The compassion is located in the motive, not necessarily in the immediate emotional reception of the delivery. He is arguing that the harsh truth is akin to a necessary surgical incision.
Okay, a surgeon cutting into your abdomen is causing trauma.
Yes, but the motive is to extract a lethal infection.
Right.
Delivering the unvarnished truth about abortion, in his view, is the necessary incision required to reach redemption, forgiveness, and healing through the gospel.
Wow. So the silence of the culture which leaves the infection to fester unchecked in the name of making the patient feel comfortable
Is what he views as true cruelty.
That distinction fundamentally changes how we understand his approach. The compassion is the rescue attempt, regardless of how violently the drowning person thrashes against the lifeguard.
Exactly.
All right, let's pivot to a second major flashpoint. Transgender identities and the intense debate over pronoun usage.
Another incredibly sensitive area.
Very. Pastor John points out that the woke movement frames the use of preferred pronouns as an issue of basic human dignity.
Right.
But Christians who hold to a traditional biblical view of gender, specifically referencing Genesis 1.27, the belief that God created humanity distinctly male and female,
Yes.
they face immense backlash, immediate silencing, and severe accusations of bigotry and transphobia when they refuse to comply.
And to illustrate the sheer scale and aggressive nature of this suppression, Pastor John uses a highly visible global cultural touchstone.
Who does he point to?
The 2020 backlash against the author J.K. Rowling.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The text notes that Rowling published an essay and a series of statements arguing that sex is real and expressing deep concerns about how the erasure of biological sex impacts women's rights and safe spaces.
Her arguments were complex and grounded in traditional feminism, yet the cultural reaction was instantaneous and apocalyptic.
It was. She was universally labeled as transphobic.
A TRF, right. A trans-exclusionary radical feminist.
Exactly. And she faced severe, sustained attempts at cultural and economic cancellation.
The inclusion of J.K. Rowling in Pastor John's sermon is a fascinating structural choice.
Why is that?
Because the irony is staggering. You have J.K. Rowling, a phenomenally wealthy, secular, politically progressive, feminist author who has historically championed liberal causes.
Right.
And then you have conservative biblical Christians, and suddenly they find themselves sitting in the exact same lifeboat.
Being targeted by the exact same cultural torpedoes.
Exactly.
It highlights the totalizing nature of the woke suppression Pastor John is diagnosing.
The system does not care about your historical credentials.
Or your wealth, or your past progressive victories. The moment you cross this specific newly drawn baseline regarding gender and biological sex,
the institutional immune system activates and attempts to excommunicate you.
which creates a complete stalemate in public discourse.
Right. If the secular culture views validating a preferred pronoun as the absolute baseline for basic human dignity, but a Christian views adherence to God's biological creation as essential to ultimate spiritual dignity.
You have two immovable objects.
You cannot compromise on mutually exclusive definitions of reality.
No, you can't.
If validating your identity requires me to violate my theology and upholding my theology requires me to invalidate your identity, There is no middle ground.
And Pastor John's point is that the culture doesn't even try to resolve the stalemate philosophically.
It just applies duct tape to the Christian's mouth and declares the problem solved in the name of inclusion.
And that transition from personal silencing to structural silencing is where Pastor John takes the argument next.
Okay, let's follow him there.
Because this suppression isn't just happening in messy, interpersonal, moral conversations about biology and identity.
Right.
He argues that this exact mechanism of suppression has aggressively infected the highest, most vital institutions of our society.
These are the institutions that were explicitly designed, historically, to be fortresses of objective inquiry.
Exactly. We are moving from the living room to the boardroom, the laboratory, and the lecture hall.
So Pastor John outlines 3 massive institutional failures where this suppression didn't just hurt feelings, it actively damaged the functional capacity of society.
Right. We're looking at campuses, COVID, and climate.
Let's unpack the first pillar, academia. He brings up a very specific, explosive incident from 2017 involving the political scientist Charles Murray at Middlebury College.
The Middlebury incident is a textbook example of institutional collapse.
Set the stage for us.
Well, the university is conceptually designed to be the ultimate marketplace of ideas.
A place where students are exposed to diverse, even controversial viewpoints, so they can learn how to dismantle bad arguments with better logic.
Precisely. So, Charles Murray was invited to speak.
And what happened?
Instead of engaging his data or debating his conclusions, a massive student mob completely shut down the event.
Yeah, because nothing screams academic rigor quite like shouting down a guest speaker.
Right. They shouted him down, physically surrounded him, and in the ensuing chaos, the liberal professor who was merely moderating the event, Allison Stanger, she was physically assaulted and injured.
It wasn't a debate. It was a riot designed to prevent speech from occurring.
Exactly.
And I think this is where that concept of an institutional immune system becomes incredibly useful.
How so?
Well, when an institution, whether it's an Ivy League college, a medical board, or a scientific community, becomes entirely captured by a singular ideology, its immune system mutates.
Right.
Instead of attacking falsehoods through rigorous testing, it starts violently rejecting any foreign ideas, any dissenting data, treating them as a deadly virus.
And Pastor John cites Romans 12.2 again here.
The warning against conforming to the patterns of the world.
Yes. By allowing ideological mobs to dictate who is allowed to speak, and by silencing opposing viewpoints through literal violence or administrative red tape.
These colleges are failing their fundamental mandate.
They are no longer educating. They are indoctrinating. They are manufacturing sterile echo chambers that completely suffocate critical thinking.
Leaving students entirely unequipped to function in a complex, diverse reality.
Right.
Which leads to a terrifying vulnerability.
What's that?
If your institutional immune system is trained to attack the wrong things, what happens when a real virus shows up?
Oh, wow. That perfectly transitions to his second institutional example, the COVID-19 pandemic.
Let's dive into that.
The pandemic serves as Pastor John's most profound example of the institutional immune system rejecting the cure in order to protect the ideological consensus. During the height of COVID, any dissenting opinions regarding the efficacy of blanket lockdowns, mask mandates, or vaccine passports.
They were instantaneously labeled as anti-science or dangerous conspiracy theories.
Exactly. He specifically points to the 2021 Great Barrington Declaration to illustrate this suppression.
Break down exactly what the Great Barrington Declaration was, because the context makes the suppression look even more absurd.
It really does. The Great Barrington Declaration was a document authored and signed by some of the most highly credentialed epidemiologists and public health scientists in the world.
We are talking about professors from Harvard, Oxford, and Stanford.
Yes, they looked at the data and advocated for an alternative approach called focused protection.
And what did that entail?
They argued that instead of universally locking down entire societies, which cause massive collateral damage to the economy, mental health, and childhood education, society should focus its resources on protecting the most vulnerable populations, like the elderly, while allowing the less vulnerable to resume normal life and build immunity.
So these weren't random people on the internet with a webcam.
No, absolutely not.
These were the apex predators of the scientific community presenting an alternative hypothesis.
Exactly.
So how did the institutional establishment and the mainstream media respond? Did they host symposiums?
Take a wild guess.
Did they engage the data in a robust empirical debate to see if focused protection was viable?
Absolutely not. They launched a coordinated campaign to destroy the credibility of the authors.
Of course they did.
The text points out that these highly credentialed scientists were dismissed as fringe epidemiologists.
From Harvard.
Right. And their proposals were grotesquely mischaracterized as eugenics and literal heresy.
I really want to linger on that specific word, heresy.
It's a loaded word.
The dark, dry irony here is almost suffocating. You have the scientific method, a philosophical process supposedly built on the relentless skeptical questioning of everything.
Right. Science is supposed to welcome challenges.
But the second these scientists questioned the wrong policy, the secular establishment dropped the clipboard, put on a medieval bishop's robe, and excommunicated them for heresy.
It is a stunning, complete role reversal.
It really is.
Secular institutions, public health, academia, mainstream science are now deploying aggressive, religious-style excommunication tactics to silence dissent.
They use a term like anti-science in the exact same way a 15th century inquisitor used the word blasphemer.
Exactly. It is not an invitation to review data. It is a linguistic weapon designed to immediately end the conversation, isolate the speaker, and destroy their professional reputation.
And Pastor John contrasts this secular dogmatism with 1 Thessalonians 5.21, right?
Yes, which explicitly commands believers to test all things and hold fast to what is good.
The biblical framework, ironically, demands rigorous testing and inquiry.
While the modern secular framework demands unquestioning, blind compliance to a manufactured consensus.
The implications of that are terrifying if you extrapolate them out.
Very terrifying.
What happens to a society that does this long term? If our universities are echo chambers and our public health institutions excommunicate their brightest scientists for questioning policy.
What is the long-term impact on our national ability to manage a crisis?
Right. If the next pandemic hits and the institutional immune system is still hardwired to destroy anyone who asks questions, we are functionally flying a commercial airliner blindfolded.
Simply because the airline fired the co-pilot for pointing out that the altimeter was broken.
Exactly.
The inevitable long-term impact is a society fundamentally disconnected from reality, entirely unable to course correct when its policies fail. And Pastor John sees this exact same pathological dynamic playing out in his third macro-institutional example, global climate change.
Okay, let's get into the climate piece.
He observes that woke culture frames any skepticism about the causes, the severity, or more specifically, the proposed solutions to climate change.
As outright climate denial.
Exactly.
And to illustrate this, he points to the intense fallout surrounding President Donald Trump's 2019 decision to withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement.
Right. Critics immediately seized the narrative, accusing Trump of ignoring the scientific consensus and painting the withdrawal as a blatantly anti-science maneuver.
But Pastor John highlights a critical nuance that was completely suppressed by the media narrative.
What was that?
Supporters of the withdrawal weren't necessarily arguing against the existence of climate change.
No, they weren't.
They were arguing that the specific terms of the Paris Agreement were economically disastrous for the working class and practically ineffective at reducing global emissions.
And this is the vital point to grasp. Pastor John isn't arguing whether Trump was definitively right or wrong about the economics.
Right. His critique is aimed at the process.
Exactly. The economic and practical arguments against the treaty were never actually engaged by the establishment.
They were just swept off the table with the magic wand of the climate denial label.
Precisely. Pastor John notes that the Bible does call humanity to be good stewards of the earth. He references the cultural mandate in Genesis 1.28, where humanity is tasked with tending to creation.
However, that biblical mandate for stewardship does not require the uncritical, blind acceptance of every single environmental policy proposed by a global summit.
No, Christians, he argues, are required to approach climate issues with truth, wisdom, and a holistic view of human flourishing.
That means weighing environmental protection against economic devastation, energy independence, and the impact on the poor simultaneously.
It is a highly complex calculus.
But woke culture does not allow for complex calculus.
No, it demands absolute zero-sum conformity.
So we've surveyed the high-altitude battlegrounds, Ivy League campus riots, global public health mandates, international climate treaties.
We have.
But Pastor John argues that the most visceral, the most intimate, and arguably the most consequential battleground isn't happening in a UN summit or a Harvard lecture hall.
Where does it happen?
It's happening right down the street at 7:00 p.m. on a Tuesday. The final battleground is the local public education system.
And this is where the cultural suppression mechanism bypasses the abstract and hits the family unit directly.
Exactly.
To demonstrate this, Pastor John cites a highly publicized 2021 incident involving a parent in Virginia.
Tell us about that.
This mother spoke out at a local school board meeting, expressing deep concern over the inclusion of highly explicit, sexually graphic books in the middle school and high school libraries.
So how did the institution, the school board, the local media respond to a mother questioning the age appropriateness of graphic material?
Did they review the material?
Did they have a nuanced discussion about community standards?
No. Her concerns about explicit sexual content were immediately dismissed,
Shocking.
and her actions were aggressively reframed by the establishment as an attempt to ban books.
There is that rewiring of the traffic light again.
It really is.
A parent standing at a microphone saying, hey, maybe a graphic novel depicting explicit sexual acts shouldn't be accessible to 12-year-olds is magically and maliciously translated into, this parent is an authoritarian fascist who wants to burn classic literature.
It's an incredible rhetorical parlor trick.
It is a trick, but it is a devastatingly effective one, because its ultimate goal is to undermine the foundational authority of the family.
And Pastor John grounds his critique here in Proverbs 22:6, the biblical mandate for parents to train up a child in the way they should go. By silencing parental concerns with aggressive accusations of censorship and bigotry, the state acting through the public school system is aggressively attempting to sever the family's authority.
Sever their authority to shape the moral, ethical, and educational values of their own children.
The state is positioning itself as the primary moral arbiter.
And this Virginia school board incident perfectly encapsulates the psychology of the broader culture.
It does.
Pastor John uses it to pivot into identifying the 3 core reasons why truth is so incredibly difficult to restore in modern America.
He breaks down the anatomy of this cultural silence.
Let's walk through his 3 points. The first reason people stay silent is the fear of backlash.
And we must recognize that this fear is entirely rational.
Oh, completely.
The cultural penalty for dissent is severe and immediate. It's no longer just someone disagreeing with you in the editorial section of a newspaper.
It is targeted social ostracism.
It is the very real threat of professional annihilation, getting fired, losing your medical or legal license.
Having your business boycotted, or being permanently deemed unemployable by corporate HR departments.
People stay silent because the threat of total ruin is real.
The second reason he identifies is moral relativism, the complete erosion of absolute truth.
We touched on this epistemology earlier, but let's dive deeper into the psychology of it.
When a society elevates individual subjective feelings above objective empirical reality, the very nature of communication changes.
Exactly.
If I believe that my subjective feeling is my reality, then any assertion you make about an absolute truth is no longer heard as a philosophical argument.
How is it heard?
It is felt as a direct, personal, and violent attack on my identity. If my feelings dictate reality, your facts are an assault on my existence.
Which perfectly explains why the cultural reaction to traditional truth is so disproportionately emotional and combative.
It feels like an existential threat.
And navigating that minefield leads directly to Pastor John's third reason for the pervasive silence. A lack of courage.
Right.
He states bluntly that many Christians, observing the landscape, fail to speak the truth boldly. They calculate the immense cost, the backlash, the smears, the potential loss of livelihood, and they opt for a comfortable, self-preserving silence.
I have to pause here.
Why is that?
Because I want to push back on Pastor John's framing on behalf of the listener. He labels it a lack of courage. And sure, from a prophetic, biblical, 10,000-foot view, maybe it is a failure of courage. But let's look at this practically on the ground in modern America.
Okay.
Is it truly a lack of courage, or is it just sheer, unadulterated, bone-deep exhaustion?
Expand on that. What is the difference in this context?
Think about the asymmetry of the warfare. If every single time you state a basic traditional belief, whether it's about the definition of marriage, basic human biology, or just what books belong in a 6th grade library, you risk your livelihood.
Your social standing.
Being publicly smeared as a hateful bigot. I mean, maybe everyday people aren't cowards. Maybe they were just practicing extreme, exhausted self-preservation.
It's a heavy burden to carry.
You can only stand in front of a cultural fire hose for so long before you just want to go home, lock the door, close the blinds, and watch Netflix. Is it cowardice to not want your family's life ruined on a random Tuesday afternoon just because you said boys are boys?
That is a deeply empathetic and accurate reading of the cultural mood.
Yeah,
The fatigue is immense.
it really is.
The cost of speaking up is wildly asymmetrical. I mean, it takes someone 1 second to label you a bigot on social media.
But it takes you years, destroyed relationships, and tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees to clear your name.
If you ever manage to do so. The system is designed to induce exhaustion.
Mm-hmm.
However, Pastor John's theological framework does not allow for exhaustion to serve as a valid excuse.
Because the biblical prophets were exhausted too, but they didn't get to quit.
Exactly. Pastor John would argue that while the exhaustion is deeply real and completely understandable, prioritizing your own temporary peace over the truth is ultimately a failure of faith.
Because the comfortable silence you retreat into today is paid for by the spiritual, cultural, and moral degradation of the next generation tomorrow.
You are passing the debt down to your children.
Which leads directly to his ultimate conclusion. If exhaustion and fear are the enemies, what is the required remedy?
That brings us to the final movement of his sermon, the call to action and the rescue mission.
Right.
Pastor John isn't just diagnosing the cultural disease. He's prescribing a very demanding, highly uncomfortable treatment.
He demands a total reclamation of courage, specifically for the sake of children and grandchildren.
And he outlines 3 non-negotiable requirements for this reclamation. First, a commitment to biblical principles.
Meaning grounding your understanding of truth not in the shifting, subjective sands of cultural consensus, but in the fixed, objective point of Scripture.
Second, he demands boldness in the face of opposition.
And to anchor this, he cites Acts 5.29.
Yes, where the early apostles, facing immense pressure from the authorities to stop preaching, declare, we must obey God rather than men.
Let's analyze the profound historical weight of that specific citation.
It's significant.
Pastor John is framing modern American Christians in the exact same light as the early, fiercely persecuted apostles who were actively defying the Roman Empire and the established religious orthodoxy of their day.
That is a massive tectonic paradigm shift for the American church.
He's essentially telling them, stop acting like you are the cultural majority who just temporarily lost an election and start acting like the subversive, marginalized, persecuted early church.
Precisely. He is completely reframing the objectives. He is not calling for a political victory. He is calling for a spiritual rescue mission.
A political victory relies on gaining a 51% majority to change the laws and regain institutional power.
Right. But a spiritual rescue mission relies on speaking the truth, regardless of whether you have 1% or 99% of the culture on your side.
The ultimate goal is not to win an election, but to restore a culture where truth is valued above comfort.
And the third requirement he lists brings us right back to that difficult tension we explored with the abortion example.
Yeah.
Compassionate communication.
Speaking truth with love, empathy, and a redemptive motive, even when the truth is devastatingly hard to deliver and harder to hear.
It's like building a generational firewall.
He is demanding that believers endure the intense short-term pain, the social ostracism, the firings, the exhaustion, the fire hose of cultural hatred to ensure long-term structural integrity for the future.
You stand in the fire now so that your grandchildren actually know what a fire is and what the truth is later.
It is a profound, incredibly sacrificial mandate. He is asking believers to willingly become the friction in a system that demands frictionless, unquestioning compliance.
Let's step back and look at the entire landscape Pastor John has mapped out for us today. We've covered a massive amount of philosophical, cultural, and theological ground.
We really have. We started by exploring Pastor John's definition of woke culture suppression tactics.
Analyzing how frameworks like intersectionality redefine dissent as hate speech to maintain an artificial, weaponized social harmony.
We looked at the theological mandate to prioritize objective truth over temporary comfort, exploring how Jesus modeled abrasive, uncompromising truth-telling to bring about true spiritual freedom.
We waded into the intense, painful cultural flashpoints of abortion and gender.
Looking at the psychological devastation of enforced silence and the stark realities of the J.K. Rowling backlash.
We analyzed the collapse of the institutional echo chambers, the suppression of Charles Murray on the university campus, the excommunication of top-tier scientists during COVID with the Great Barrington Declaration.
And the silencing of economic debates surrounding climate change. We saw how the modern secular establishment has mutated its immune system, using religious-style heresy trials to enforce ideological consensus.
We dropped into the local classroom to look at the anatomy of silence.
How fear of backlash, the rise of moral relativism, and sheer grinding exhaustion drive everyday people into a comfortable but ultimately destructive silence.
And finally, we unpacked Pastor John's ultimate call to action, a bold, compassionate, apostolic defiance that demands believers obey God rather than men for the sake of future generations.
It is a comprehensive, deeply integrated, and highly challenging worldview.
He seamlessly connects the microscopic local interactions over middle school library books to the macroscopic mandates of global climate treaties,
Identifying the exact same underlying spiritual pathology operating in both arenas.
It's a highly intricate architectural framework.
It is. We hope we've given you the blueprints of his thought process.
Because understanding the structural architecture of an argument is the only way to genuinely intellectually engage with it.
Whether you ultimately intend to adopt it, refine it, or dismantle it completely.
Now, we always like to leave you with something to chew on.
A final, provocative thought that builds entirely on the text's internal logic, but pushes it just one step further into uncomfortable territory.
This raises a fascinating question based on Pastor John's own biblical framework.
He unites with great emphasis that Jesus was a bold truth-teller who relentlessly confronted the religious leaders of his day about their hypocrisy, their focus on outward compliance, and their spiritual deadness.
Jesus actively critiqued the establishment that claimed to speak for God.
So if we apply that exact biblical framework to the modern era, who are the religious leaders today?
Pastor John makes a highly compelling case that the secular, woke establishment acts as an oppressive, pseudo-religious orthodoxy.
But does modern institutional Christianity ever fall into the exact same trap?
Are there times when the church itself becomes an ideological echo chamber, prioritizing institutional harmony, protecting its leaders, and chasing political power over speaking uncomfortable prophetic truth?
Does the modern church ever find its own institutional immune system silencing the very truth-tellers that Jesus modeled?
If the immune system of secular institutions can become corrupted to reject the truth in order to protect power, we must critically ask if the immune system of religious institutions is susceptible to that exact same corruption.
It's a question that demands rigorous, often painful self-reflection from anyone who claims to hold the absolute truth.
It is the ultimate mirror to hold up.
If you are going to wield the prophetic hammer against the culture, you have to be willing to let that exact same hammer strike your own foundation to see if it holds.
Well said.
Thank you so much for joining us for this rigorous intellectual exercise on the Discernment Drop today.
We know it's dense, we know it's heavy.
But navigating the muddy waters of our modern cultural landscape requires this kind of relentless curiosity and structural mapping. Keep questioning, keep seeking clarity in a noisy world, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.